The American Civil War has remained in history as the largest and bloodiest conflict on the American continent. In the early 1860s, a series of sharp political, economic and ethical contradictions between the North and South of the United States, which led to the split of the country. But before we get started subscribing to our channel, give us a like and post the video on social media. Next, we will tell you how the war that changed the United States of America forever began, developed and how it ended. The northern states were mostly populated by enterprising, down-to-earth people. Immigrants from all over the world flocked here in search of a better life. They developed industry, built large cities, and constructed railroads. The northern states guaranteed personal freedom to everyone and sought to create a capitalist state with a strong centralized government. In the South lived planters, rich descendants of the European aristocracy. They owned vast farmlands and used slaves to work them. Southerners lived a measured life away from the big cities and held conservative views. Politics in the South was based on the principle of, do what you want, but do not interfere with others. Each state, in fact, was an independent state. The causes of the Civil War in the United States can be divided into three groups. 1. Political contradictions. The population of the northern states was replenished by free immigrants, and the South by slaves imported from abroad. This led to the fact that only 1/4 of the population of the southern states had the right to vote by the early 1860s. Southerners feared that with this dynamic, all controversial political issues in Congress would be decided in favor of the North by majority vote. In addition, the North-based central government sought to extend influence to all states, while the southern territories wished to maintain local self-government. 2. Economic differences. All industry in the country was centered in the North, while cotton, sugarcane, tobacco, and other productive crops were harvested in the South. For a long time, the southern states shipped raw materials to the North, where local planters processed them and exported the goods. At a certain point, however, planters realized that it was much more profitable to trade with Europe without intermediaries. Factory owners in the North risked going without supplies, and their goods in the South were being displaced by European goods. In an effort to protect the domestic market, the government imposed huge taxes on trade with Europe, causing resentment among Southerners. 3. Attitudes toward slavery. All Southern agriculture was based on slave labor, while the use of unskilled slaves in factories was inefficient. Northern industrialists needed free laborers and favored the abolition of slavery. For Southern planters, this would mean the collapse of the entire economic system built on free labor. The moral side of the issue was also important. Many American public figures criticized slavery as an inhuman relic of the past and demanded its abolition. America's schism. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln became President of the United States. He ran from the Republican Party, which favored the abolition of slavery and support for the country's domestic market. Lincoln's rise to power provoked the Southern states to take decisive action. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina declared secession from the United States. Within months, it was joined by North Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Tennessee, Arizona, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, and Florida. These states organized a new state, the Confederate States of America, CSA, with Richmond as its capital. They adopted a new constitution and elected Jefferson Davis as president, who declared that slavery will exist forever in the CSA. All of Lincoln's offers to discuss the situation at the negotiating table were rebuffed. The country was split in two. An armed conflict was imminent. The balance of power. The U.S. retained control over 23 states, including 4 slave states: Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland, whose loyalty had to be fought for by force. The population of the northern states was much larger, 22 million people versus 9 million in the Confederacy, some of whom were slaves. In addition, the North had industry and infrastructure on its side, with 70% of the railroads coming from the northern states. Despite this, the South also had serious advantages. First, the planters had considerable financial resources. Second, virtually the entire senior officer corps, including the talented General Robert Lee, was on the Confederate side. The Southerners were carefully preparing for the upcoming war. In advance, pulled troops to the border, stockpiled weapons and food. The main events of the American Civil War. First phase of the war. Hostilities began on April 12, 1861, with the Confederate capture of Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Its garrison remained loyal to the federal government and refused to surrender, but was forced to surrender after a 34-hour bombardment. In response, Lincoln declared the Southern states to be in rebellion and began calling for volunteers and later imposed conscription. Similar actions were taken in the South. The first major battle took place in Virginia. On July 18, the Federation Army crossed the border at Bull Run River but was defeated by Confederate troops. The poorly trained soldiers of the Northerners turned to flight. Had the Southerners pursued them and moved on Washington, D.C., American history might have turned out differently. However, the Confederacy did not set out to conquer the North, so the Southern Army remained on the frontier. By the fall, Federal Commander-in-Chief George McClellan assembled a large army to invade Virginia, but was also defeated. Significantly more successful for the northern states were actions at sea. Most of the war fleet remained under federal control, so the Northerners were able to blockade several major southern ports, depriving the Confederacy of supplies from Europe. In 1862, the Northern Army was successful in the West. At the cost of many lives, they managed to dislodge Southerners from Kentucky, occupy the states of Tennessee and Missouri, and then invade northern Alabama and Mississippi. On April 12, 1862, a group of Northern saboteurs stole a steam locomotive from the Confederates in Georgia and set off for Tennessee, setting bridges on fire behind them, defacing rails, and cutting telegraph wires. The Confederates tried to catch up with them on another steam locomotive. This episode went down in the history of the American Civil War as the Great Locomotive Race. That same spring, the world's first battle of battleships took place. The Confederate-built battleship Virginia attempted to break the naval blockade by destroying several wooden Federation ships, but encountered an equal opponent, the battleship Monitor. Their battle lasted over 3 hours, but the ships proved unable to destroy each other. Nevertheless, this episode revolutionized naval affairs, proving to the world the superiority of the steel fleet over the wooden one. In the early summer of 1862 on the Eastern Front, McClellan, nicknamed Slowpoke for his indecisive actions, was removed as commander-in-chief and sent with the army to storm Richmond, the Confederate capital. He had at his disposal an army of 100,000 men, but even this force was not sufficient to take the fortifications erected on the approaches to the city by General Lee. In a battle that has gone down in history as the 7 Days Battle, from June 25 to July 1, both armies suffered tremendous losses. About 2,000 killed and 8,000 wounded for the North and nearly 3,500 killed and 16,000 wounded for the South. General Lee's troops managed not only to defend Rincon, but also to go on the counteroffensive. On September 17, 1862 at Antietam Creek they were blocked by McClellan's 75,000-man army. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest day of the Civil War in the United States. More than 3,000 men died on both sides of the front in one day. The battle ended in a virtual draw, but the Southerners retreated. Lincoln demanded a decisive counterattack from McClellan, but the slow-moving general was slow to act and was resigned. A new commander, Ambrose Burnside, did not undertake an attack on Richmond until December 1862, but was also defeated by General Lee and removed from command. The first phase of the war turned out poorly for the North. Despite numerical superiority, they failed to break the defenses of the South. The authority of Lincoln, who still hoped to solve the problem without unnecessary bloodshed, began to fall. He was condemned for indecision and weakness of character. The defeats of those years forced Washington to move to tougher measures. The second stage of the war. In early 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, according to which all slaves in the southern states were declared free. Negroes were given the opportunity to fight for their independence in the ranks of the Federation Army. This decision completely changed the nature of the war. Now it was fought not only to preserve the unity of the United States, but also for the abolition of slavery. Great Britain and France, former trading partners of the southern states, now looked favorably on Lincoln's actions, and Russia even sent a naval squadron to support the president, but the Russians did not participate in the war. The beginning of the year was unsuccessful for the Federation. Another attack on Richmond, 130,000 troops, turned out to be a complete defeat from twice smaller Army Lee. The battle lasted 6 days, and the total losses of the parties amounted to 18,500 killed and wounded. Learning from the mistake of the year before, Lee launched a counteroffensive on Washington, but was stopped by the army of General George Meade, the new commander of the North. From July 1, 1863, the famous Battle of Gettysburg took place. The battle was extremely fierce, with the Southerners seeking a final victory and the Northerners fighting on their own soil for the first time. In the end, the Confederates retreated, losing 27,000 men killed and wounded. The North Vietnamese losses were slightly less, so they were unable to pursue the enemy and build on their success. At the same time, on the Western Front, the Federation troops won another important victory. They managed to capture the fortress of Vicksburg in Louisiana. Now the North controlled the entire Mississippi River Valley, and the Confederacy was divided into two parts. By the end of 1863, all military and financial resources of the Confederacy were running out, but the fighting spirit of the South was still strong. They put up fierce resistance to the Army of the North, now and then throwing it back. In 1864, the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Army Ulysses Grant developed a plan for the final defeat of the Confederacy. The first blow was to be struck by General William Sherman. He entered Georgia, and without counting losses, destroying everything in his path, moved to the Atlantic Ocean. Grant himself, with an army of 118,000, attacked in the east, meeting enemy troops in the forest of Glush. In the Battle of the Wilderness, Grant lost 18,000 men, but that didn't stop him. With bloody fighting and heavy losses, he pushed on until he was stopped by General Lee in the 13-day Battle of Cold Harbor, May 31 to June 12. Having failed to gain the upper hand, Grant withdrew and laid siege to the town of Petersburg. This siege lasted nearly a year. Meanwhile, Sherman's army fought its way to the Atlantic coast. By December, he had occupied the coastal towns of Atlanta and Savannah, and then turned to join Grant's forces. By the spring of 1865, Grant had more than 115,000 men at his disposal, while Lee had only 54,000 remaining. His army began to retreat but became encircled. On April 9, General Lee and the remnants of his army surrendered to Grant at the Appomattox River. 5 days after the surrender of the Army of the South, the assassination of President Lincoln took place. On April 14, 1865, he was shot and killed by Southern supporter John Booth in the box at Ford's Theater. On May 10, with the arrest of Jefferson Davis and other members of the government, the Confederate States of America ceased to exist. Individual units of the CSA still continued to resist, but by August 1865 the war was over. Results of the American Civil War. The American Civil War was the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history. 600,000 dead and 400,000 missing. The main outcome of the war was the famous 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which abolished slavery throughout the country. It was a major step toward equality in American society. At the same time, the amendment did not provide former slaves with even minimal property. They were simply thrown out of the plantations, leaving them to their fate. This led to an increase in crime in the war-torn states. To restore order, the white population began to unite in armed organizations, one of which was the infamous Ku Klux Klan. The Federation armies in the rebellious states behaved like invaders. They destroyed plantations with already harvested crops, burned villages, and smashed cities. It took more than a decade for the U.S. economy to recover from the Civil War. Troops were withdrawn from the states of the former Confederacy only in 1877. Despite all the harsh consequences, the American Civil War brought a number of positive changes. The government was able to maintain the integrity of the country. The abolition of slavery was the first step toward equalizing the rights of whites and blacks. The centralization of power and the strengthening of the domestic market later made the United States one of the most developed countries in the world. The war hardened America's army and promoted the development of military science. An important feature of the American Civil War was the use of the latest technological advances. Machine guns, mines, observation balloons and battleships, ramming ships and even submarines were used for the first time in large-scale fighting and proved their effectiveness. Guys, if you liked our video, but you haven't subscribed to us yet, subscribe right now and post the video in social networks. There will be a lot of interesting things in the next episodes. See you soon. Bye.